Here we are, at the end of the semester. We've come a long way, haven't we? I promised myself I wouldn't cry, but I'm going to miss you. I feel like we've really gotten to know each other well over the last several weeks. Parting is such sweet sorrow. But, alas, we still have work to do. The final topic we'll be looking at is the idea of unconscious bias in employment. This is a serious problem that doesn't receive enough attention, in my view, and there is no easy solution to it. I'm now going to hand it over to the professor.
Thanks, Irving. Yes, here we are at the end of the line. Can I just say that it has been an honor and a pleasure working alongside you? Even though you're just an avatar, I also consider you my friend. And for you students out there, I also want to take this opportunity to say that it's been an enjoyable ride. And I hope you've learned as much about the social psychology of work as I've learned from teaching this class. As Irving said, this is our last week and our last lecture. We'll be learning about unconscious bias, also commonly referred to as implicit bias. By this is meant that all human beings hold prejudices that we are not even aware of. And these prejudices can have a huge impact on others' life chances and especially employment chances. Our unconscious or subconscious minds impact our behaviors and choices in ways that are not even apparent to us. This is a serious problem because it means that we are perhaps inadvertently discriminating unfairly against people. There will only be one lecture this week instead of two. The reason is that the activity that I want you to do on the LMS forum may take a little longer this week because it involves taking a test. But don't worry, it's not a graded test. It's called an implicit association test, and you'll learn more about it during this lecture. Let's get started, shall we? Before we talk about unconscious bias, we should clarify what is meant by employee sorting. This is a term related to human resource management. HR managers are responsible for the recruitment and selection of employees and for the promotion of existing employees. So, employee sorting is the process by which employees are selected either to join an organization or to be promoted within an organization. Generally speaking, HR managers will try to hire or promote the best person for the job. Identifying the best person for the job depends on their understanding of performance or performance capability. Now, in theory, all employment sorting decisions should be made exclusively on the basis of performance or performance capability. In practice, though, less qualified people are hired or promoted over more qualified people all the time. Why might this be? Well, social psychology offers a potential answer. Individuals belonging to disadvantaged social groups often face prejudice and discrimination in the labor market. Similarly, individuals belonging to dominant social groups enjoy a privileged status that often places them above members of the disadvantaged groups. The key problem we'll be focusing on in this lecture is the idea of unconscious bias. This involves discrimination and prejudice that exists in the shadow of one's consciousness. We all have unconscious biases, even if we're not aware of them. The question is, what, if anything, can be done about them? It may seem odd at first glance to think of discrimination as good and bad. We usually assume that all discrimination is bad. Well, it isn't. There are good forms of discrimination. In fact, if you think about it, the job of an HR manager is to discriminate against job applicants and employees. What does it mean to discriminate? Discrimination means giving preference to one person over another. Let's think a bit about what good discrimination might look like. Imagine that you're a hiring manager. and two applicants apply for a job. One has 15 years of experience working in that role and a good track record, and the other has only 2 years of experience with an uncertain track record. A good HR manager would obviously give preference for the one with more experience. That's discrimination. You're discriminating against the one with less work experience. But as a society, we've agreed that this is an acceptable form of discrimination. The same is true with prestige of university. Employers tend to hire applicants with a degree from Cambridge over ones from a less prestigious university. Again, that's an acceptable form of discrimination by societal standards. HR managers constantly discriminate. In fact, that's just their job. They select employees and applicants with superior knowledge, skills, abilities, scores on psychometric tests, employment references, etc. But there are also bad forms of discrimination. We have agreed as a society that these forms of discrimination are not okay under any circumstances. And at least in the developed world, we implement laws to protect people against this kind of discrimination. For example, we cannot give preference to members of one race over another, or to one gender over another. We cannot discriminate against people because of a disability or their sexual orientation. We cannot discriminate on the basis of religious belief or age or marital status or pregnancy status. Of course, discrimination on the basis of these characteristics still happens all the time in the labor market, but society does not give it a seal of approval, so to speak. So there is good discrimination and bad discrimination, but there's another category, which could be called ambiguous discrimination. These are forms of discrimination that might feel wrong to us, but are typically not legally regulated. For example, what about appearance-based discrimination? More attractive people are generally more successful in employment than less attractive people. Is this okay? Well, it depends on who you ask. Another form of ambiguous discrimination is unconscious bias, which is the topic of this lecture. We know, for example, that race-based discrimination is wrong, but what if the manager isn't doing it intentionally or on purpose? What if it happens in the shadow of one's consciousness? This is what we're going to look at in this lecture. By way of introduction to this topic, I ask that you watch this brief video, which was put together by the Royal Society.
The unconscious mind is amazing. It can process vastly more information than our conscious mind by using shortcuts based on our background, cultural environment, and personal experiences to make almost instantaneous decisions about everything around us. The snag is, it's wrong quite a lot of the time, especially on matters that need rational thinking. Here's a classic example. A bat and a ball cost £1 10 pence. If the bat costs £1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost? Most people, including over 50% of students at some of the world's leading universities, get the answer wrong and say 10 pence. The answer is actually 5 pence. Many of us choose 10 pence without thinking. This is because our unconscious mind uses instinct, not analysis. So our unconscious is fallible. It's also biased. It makes snap judgments of people we meet, categorizing them according to gender, social, and other characteristics. In milliseconds, we judge whether somebody is like us and belongs to our in-group. These are the people we favor. So men might favor men, while women might favor women. However, we can belong to different in-groups, and we like to be part of an in-group that's powerful, which could mean a woman favoring a man over a woman. That's unconscious bias. All of us have it, and it colors our decisions without our realizing. For example, research reveals that if I were a man, you would be more likely to be nodding in agreement right now because people pay more attention to a male voice. The Royal Society fosters excellence in science, but this can only be achieved if we select from the widest range of talent. And that's not possible if unconscious bias is narrowing down the field for non-scientific reasons. To lessen the impact of unconscious bias, which is easier for us to notice in others, we are raising the awareness of unconscious bias to members of our selection and appointment panels. We're encouraging panel members to deliberately slow down decision-making, reconsider reasons for decisions, question cultural stereotypes, and monitor each other for unconscious bias. We can't cure unconscious bias, but with self-awareness, we can address it.
The unconscious mind is absolutely fascinating. It is that part of our mind that exists in the shadow of consciousness. We are aware of our conscious mind and our conscious thoughts. We even have some discretion over them. But at the unconscious or even subconscious level, the influence on our actions and behaviors is hidden from plain sight. For this reason, what we believe consciously about ourselves does not always correspond to our actions and behaviors. The unconscious mind is largely composed of impulses and instincts. In this way, it mirrors the behavior of animals. An animal cannot be said to be self-aware like we are, and yet their brain still drives their behaviors. So it is with us also. We have developed impulses and instincts over millennia through the processes of natural selection. Evolutionary forces have shaped our brains in ways that we are not even aware of. At the conscious level, we are self-aware. We possess a social identity, and our behavior is governed by social norms. But at an unconscious level, our mind guides us in ways that we are not aware of. For example, at a conscious level, you might think that you are an anti-racist social justice warrior. This might even be how you describe yourself and to others. But unconsciously, you may exhibit racist tendencies and have a preference for your own race. Let's consider another example. At a conscious level, a man might describe himself as a feminist, but at an unconscious level, he may harbor implicitly negative views towards women. The key problem here is that our unintended, unconscious attitudes can at times override our conscious attitudes. This is what makes the unconscious mind so dangerous. You may not believe yourself to be a prejudiced person, but that does not mean that you are not a prejudiced person. Some psychologists would even go so far as to argue that everyone is prejudiced to some degree. But if the unconscious mind is something that we're not even aware of, how can we measure it? How do we know that it's really there? Fortunately, psychologists have developed a tool to evaluate unconscious biases, the implicit association test, also referred to as the IAT. Let me pose to you a challenge. How do you measure unconscious biases if they are unconscious? You obviously cannot ask people about their unconscious biases because they are unaware of them. This is a real dilemma. Psychologists have theorized the existence of the unconscious mind for a long time. going as far back as Freud. But until 1998, they had no effective way of measuring unconscious biases or preferences. That year, some prominent psychologists at Harvard University designed what they called the implicit association test. This is a psychometric test that they claim can evaluate and assess the extent to which an individual is implicitly biased in favor of one group or against another. This test was truly groundbreaking in that it can, in theory, circumvent the social desirability bias that we all have. What does this mean, social desirability bias? Well, very few people will admit to being prejudiced because prejudice isn't looked upon favorably by the rest of society. But with this test, people aren't able to hide or conceal their prejudices. It is able to reach into the deepest recesses of our minds to measure our implicit biases, according to the designers of the test. In fact, it is more than just one test. There are several implicit association tests that are said to measure different forms of implicit bias. One claims to indicate whether a subject is implicitly ageist, for example, and has a preference for young people over older people. Another claims to indicate whether the subject is implicitly biased in favor of one gender over the other. Others claim to indicate an implicit preference for certain religions, body shapes, sexual orientations, etc. Believe it or not, there is even a test to determine whether you are implicitly prejudiced against Donald Trump. These tests are a bit hard to describe, but the way they work is that they calculate a score that is based on the amount of time it takes to make associations between visual stimuli, which are usually photographs, and a set of good and bad words. In order to better understand how these tests work, let's take a look at the implicit association test aimed at measuring implicit race bias. The implicit association test is really hard to describe. I'm going to show you a video of what it looks like in just a minute, and for this week's activity, I'm going to ask you to take a couple implicit association tests yourselves. But let me try to describe the race IAT for you. In this test, you will be presented with a series of visual stimuli consisting of photographs of black and white faces, and also a series of words with positive and negative valences. The words with positive valence include, for example, joy, love, peace, wonderful, pleasure, glorious, laughter, and happy. The words with negative valence include agony, terrible, horrible, nasty, evil, awful, failure, and hurt. During the test itself, you will be asked to make associations between, for example, white faces and positive valence words and black faces and negative valence words, followed by another round of associations, but this time reversed. That is, you'll be asked to associate white faces with negative valence words and black faces with positive valence words. Your score will depend on the length of time and the number of association mistakes you make when the associations are reversed. Still confused? Well, no worries. You'll understand soon enough. But for now, I just want to give you the statistics associated with the race IAT. Less than 20% of Americans report an explicit preference for their own race. This can be interpreted as an explicit bias in favor of one's own race and against other races. But roughly 70 to 80% of Americans demonstrate, using this test, an implicit preference for their own race over another. This is what I mean when I say that there is a disconnect between our explicit conscious attitudes and behaviors and our implicit unconscious attitudes and behaviors. Let's take a look at what the race IAT looks like.
Time to discuss the implicit association test, the IAT, which is now the most popular tool for measuring implicit bias. Just to be clear, the test itself, a reaction time measure, isn't the same thing as the underlying construct, implicit bias. It's just a quick and dirty measurement device. The best way to understand the IAT is to take a test yourself, which you can do easily and anonymously at Project Implicit. For now, I'll offer a quick synopsis. Understanding the IAT, and indeed all reaction time measures, begins with a basic insight. It's always easier for our brains to sort two concepts together if they are closely associated in our minds. For example, if I say the word dog and ask you to complete this word, you'll be quicker to think cat than bat. Or if I say the word doctor, you will be quicker to think nurse than purse. Armed with this insight, scientists created the IAT, which measures how quickly we sort various pictures and words flash on a computer screen together. Our sorting speed reflects how tightly we associate any two concepts. Quicker sorting means stronger association. The black-white race attitude test, for example, compares implicit attitudes toward two racial categories, black folks and white folks. Each racial category is represented by cropped photos of male faces. To begin, you're asked to sort the faces as quickly as possible. If you see a white face, hit a key to your left. If you see a black face, hit a key to your right. Next, you sort words that represent two attitudinal categories, good and bad. When you see a good word such as beauty, hit a key to your left. When you see a bad word such as filth, hit a key to your right. Now the real challenge starts. You're instructed to sort both photos and words, whatever flashes on the screen. For some runs, you are instructed to press the same key for white faces and good words, say on your left, and a different same key for black faces and bad words, say on your right. If you have a more positive association with white folks as compared to black folks, then in this particular arrangement, you will find your groove and fly through the test. Most of us do. But on other runs, which are randomized and counterbalanced, the IAT will give you different directions. Press the same key for white faces and bad words, and another same key for black faces and good words. In these runs, most players can't quite get into a groove, take longer to respond, and make more mistakes by hitting the wrong key. The average time differential between the two arrangements, white plus good as compared to black plus good, is called the IAT effect and reflects the strength of an attitude. On average, we might be a fraction of a second faster pairing white faces with good words than black faces with good words. This means that on average, we have an implicit preference for whites.
So, how can we explain the existence of implicit or unconscious bias? Why does it exist? In fact, we could draw a linkage between unconscious bias and Tajfel's concept of exaggeration and polarization. Recall that social identity theory posits that we impose very rigid categories upon the social world, especially in relation to group membership. In many ways, this is exactly what we do implicitly without even being aware of the fact that we're doing it. But again, getting back to the key question, why do our brains do this? The answer arguably rests in evolutionary psychology. In short, our attitudes, beliefs, values, and preferences can be said to have evolved over millennia and are a function of our experiences in the ancestral environment. At the dawn of humankind, we developed a preference for people who looked like us. This preference for the in group was a survival strategy, and it is, according to evolutionary psychologists, now hardwired into our brains. Think about it. The people we trust the most are those who look the most like us, our family members. We then look most like others from those of the same race. In the ancestral environment, when someone approached from a different race, our brains learned to view such outsiders as a potential threat. In this sense, implicit bias against members of the outgroup may be hardwired into our minds. In fact, cognitive neuroscientists have provided some hard evidence of this phenomenon using functional magnetic resonance imaging. Thus, implicit bias can be seen visually through brain scans. The amygdala is the part of the brain where the fear response is located. When we are afraid, it activates. Neuroscientists have imaged the brain whilst subjects are taking an implicit association test. When, for example, a white person sees a white face, there is no amygdala activation. There is no fear. But when a white person sees a non-white face, the amygdala lights up, suggesting that these unconscious impulses, which give preference to the in-group and reveal fear of the out-group, can in fact be measured. Prejudice may be a survival mechanism that has evolved since the beginning of civilization. Even if at a conscious level we are not racist, many people may harbor racial preferences, according to evolutionary psychologists. So, what does implicit bias look like in the context of work and employment? How can it rear its ugly head in the labor market? Well, imagine that you are a recruiter or a hiring manager. You've just advertised for some positions and you receive a pile of resumes for the jobs. You now have to sort through the resumes and decide whom to invite in for an interview. Given that job advertisements often result in many applications, many more than you need, you don't have much time to spend reviewing the resumes. Well, in a 2004 study published in the American Economic Review, two economists, Bertrand and Mullainathan, sent 5,000 resumes in response to 1,300 real job advertisements. They then measured the number of callbacks for each resume. The stimuli that they used, that is, the resumes, were systematically manipulated. Half of the resumes used white-sounding names like Emily and Greg. The other half used black-sounding names like Lakeisha and Jamal. At the end of the experiment, they found that the resumes with the white-sounding names received significantly more callbacks from employers than the resumes with black-sounding names. It is possible that some of this preference for white applicants was down to explicit prejudice on the part of the recruiters. That is, some of them may be consciously and explicitly prejudiced against non-white job applicants. But it is also very likely that some of this discrimination happened implicitly and unconsciously. Many of the recruiters were not even aware of the fact that they were favoring members of the in-group over and above members of the out-group. Again, this is what makes unconscious bias so very dangerous. We are unable to detect it even in ourselves. Well, that's a bit depressing now, isn't it? Unconscious bias is dangerous and it's prevalent. It impacts people's life chances in ways that we are not even aware of. So, what are we supposed to do about it? Unconscious bias is hard, if not impossible, to change. You cannot simply audit your unconscious mind. The only thing you can be aware of are the thoughts that you are aware of. This sounds like tautology, and of course it is, but such an argument is necessary to show the difficulties associated with changing or altering implicit bias. To do so, we would essentially need to reprogram tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. Although this is no easy task, some recent advances give us hope that we may be able to proactively reduce unconscious biases. Researchers have carried out interventions known as other race training, some of which have been shown to reduce implicit bias. Other race training means the subject is made to imagine that he or she is a member of another race, thereby gaining empathy for members of the outgroup and thus reducing unconscious bias. Here's how it works. Imagine a white man taking an implicit association test. When he sees the non-white faces, his amygdala lights up, suggesting an implicit fear response, as we've already discussed. But afterwards, he's asked to imagine himself to be a non-white person. Let's say, for example, he enters a virtual reality environment where his body is no longer white, but is now black. He sees himself as a black person and learns to identify with that other race. After the other race training, he retakes the implicit association test. This time, when he sees the black face, the amygdala activation is significantly weaker, suggesting that he no longer fears members of the outgroup. These developments suggest that it may be possible to rewrite the brain to erase or at least to reduce implicit bias. This is good news from an equality and diversity point of view, but it also raises some very difficult questions. Are there dangers associated with trying to alter the unconscious mind? Can we really reprogram tens of thousands of years of evolution using a short training intervention? Perhaps more crucially, who gets to decide what biases are appropriate and which are inappropriate and need to be reprogrammed? If the human mind really is like a computer, can we trust ourselves to be our own programmers? These are big questions for which there are no easy answers. Okay, that concludes this week's lecture. I'm now going to hand it back over to Irving so that he can tell you about this week's activity for the online forum. Take it away, Irving.